They had been told that the Soviet Air Force was primitive, that its machines were crude, its airfields frozen wastelands, and its pilots undisciplined men flying relics of the 1930s. For years, this belief was repeated in every training hall, every officer's briefing, every whispered conversation inside the cockpits of Manchurian bases. Yet in August 1945, when the clouds lifted and Japanese reconnaissance planes approached the borderlands near Halar and Mukden, what they saw broke the logic of everything they had been taught. Below them stretched not emptiness, but order. Massive Soviet airfields carved into the Manchurian steppe with perfect geometric precision, lines of aircraft glinting in the dawn. Runways paved and extended far beyond what Japanese engineers thought possible under wartime constraints. They had been invisible only days before. Now they were alive, roaring with movement, the silhouettes of bombers and fighters forming into shapes that seemed to materialize out of nowhere. The pilots stared down, speechless, believing for a moment that they were looking at a mirage. The Imperial Japanese Army Air Service had operated from Manchuria for years. It was their fortress in the north, a place of dominance. Soviet aviation in the region had been negligible, almost absent. Yet here, in the final week of the war, entire Soviet divisions had appeared overnight. Their airfields were fresh, the earth still marked by new construction, but the discipline, the scale, and the tone. Coordination spoke of years of preparation. The pilots reported what they saw, but even in Tokyo, few believed them. Intelligence officers dismissed the reports as errors, products of stress or atmospheric distortion. It could not be true, and yet the photographs returned from the reconnaissance cameras told a different story. In those images, one could trace the pattern of Soviet planning: enormous grids of runways, camouflaged fuel depots, and railways linking each airbase directly to Siberia. The entire operation had been hidden under the shroud of neutrality. For months, Japanese command had assumed Stalin would remain cautious, bound by his pact until Japan's formal collapse. But the photographs made clear that the Red Army had been preparing for something far larger than a token invasion. Beneath the calm facade of diplomacy, a military machine had been constructed in silence. The Japanese pilots, trained to recognize every type of airfield across Asia, could see the unmistakable signs of power. Concrete runways longer than any in Manchuria, underground hangars cut into the hills, and the faint glimmer of radar. Installations where none had existed before. When the first Soviet aircraft rose to meet them, the illusion of Japanese aerial superiority disintegrated. The Yakovlev fighters climbed with astonishing speed, their engines whining with a new ferocity. They were not the obsolete biplanes of Khalkhin Gol in 1939. These were modern, sleek machines built for rapid interception. The Japanese observers realized the terrible implication. While Japan had been consumed by the Pacific War, the Soviet Union had rearmed and reorganized its entire Eastern Aviation Command. The supposed emptiness of Siberia had been filled with the noise of construction, training, and mobilization, all hidden from the eyes of Japan's intelligence. The shock among the air crews was not only tactical, but existential. For years, they had believed themselves to be the sentinels of Asia, the masters of the skies above the continent. The idea that another power could build such immense infrastructure, so close and so secretly, struck at the core of the empire's confidence. It was not simply that the Soviets had arrived, it was that they had been there all along, waiting behind the horizon, invisible until the exact hour of attack. The pilots returned from their missions silent, their reports short and factual, but their eyes haunted. One intelligence officer later wrote in his diary, "The Russians have airfields where there should be deserts. They have plains where there should be grass. It is as if the earth itself betrayed us." As August advanced, the reality became undeniable. Entire Soviet air armies began to move across the border, their formations covering the skies from Mongolia to the Sea of Japan. Each base the Japanese pilots had photographed now erupted with activity. Transport aircraft unloading mechanized brigades, bombers refueling for strikes, fighters taxiing in perfect synchrony. It was a vision of industrial warfare Japan could no longer match. On the ground, Manchurian garrisons prepared in confusion, their supply lines already collapsing under the pressure of the unexpected offensive. From above, the pilots witnessed the unraveling of an empire that had once believed it controlled the fate of the continent. What remained most shocking was not the destruction itself, but the perfection of the Soviet deception. For months, perhaps years, they had concealed vast construction projects in the forests and plains beyond Lake Baikal. Even American reconnaissance had underestimated the scale. And now, in a matter of days, the full weight of that preparation had materialized. For Japanese airmen, the war ended not in defeat over Tokyo, but in disbelief over Manchuria. Watching from their cockpits as Soviet airfields they never knew existed came alive beneath them, a silent army of steel and concrete rising. From the earth to close the final chapter of the empire. The scale of the operation defied every calculation of Japanese intelligence. For years, the Kwantung army had treated the Soviet frontier as a quiet border guarded only by distant observation posts and small garrisons. The officers believed they understood the terrain so completely that no enemy could build a base undetected. Yet as the aerial photographs were analyzed frame by frame, new patterns emerged: roads freshly cut through dense taiga, bridges reinforced to bear the weight of tanks, and railway sidings filled with flat cars carrying aircraft crates marked only by numbers. The Soviets had not merely expanded their frontier defenses, they had transformed the entire region into a launch platform for invasion. The Buck. Japanese analysts studying the images in Harbin could hardly believe what they were seeing. The new airfields were connected by telegraph lines and camouflaged revetments, and their layouts followed a discipline unknown in the East. It was not improvisation. It was doctrine. Reports filtered upward through the hierarchy, but they met silence. The high command in Tokyo had already surrendered to another illusion, that the war's end was near, but that it would be negotiated, not taken. Stalin's sudden entry into the Pacific War seemed to many an impossibility. The airmen who had seen the new Soviet bases firsthand were told to stand by, to conserve fuel, to avoid unnecessary reconnaissance. Yet on the morning of August 9, 1945, when the horizon erupted with the roar of engines and the glint of silver wings moving in dense formation, the truth could no longer be hidden. Soviet aircraft poured across the skies in precise waves, following routes pre-mapped and timed to the minute. They came from airfields that had not existed on Japanese charts a week earlier. From above, Japanese pilots could see the new war unfold like a mechanical tide. Soviet bombers swept in at medium altitude, striking communication hubs and rail centers. Fighters followed to cut off any Japanese intercept attempt. The coordination was flawless, a level of control that spoke of months of training. The airfields in Transbaikal and the maritime province functioned as a single organism, their logistics synchronized to the second. Japanese observers who managed to radio reports described it as a moving continent of steel. The speed of Soviet deployment seemed beyond human scale. The aircraft landed, refueled, and launched again without pause. Even when bombs fell upon Japanese positions, the greater shock was psychological. The realization that their opponents had mastered the same industrial precision that Japan had once admired in Germany. In the following hours, Japanese pilots who attempted to engage were outnumbered and outflown. Their aircraft, many built in the early years of the war, struggled to climb against the new Yak and Laceries fighters. The dogfights were brief and brutal. The Soviets operated in large formations, their discipline mechanical and their coordination absolute. Japanese airmen, trained for individual combat and valor, found themselves powerless. In the face of mathematical warfare, one after another, they were driven back toward their airstrips, which now lay exposed under continuous reconnaissance. The Soviets photographed everything, methodically recording the disintegration of Japan's northern air defense network. On the ground, mechanics and ground crews listened helplessly to radio traffic that spoke of defeat in coded fragments. "Enemy formations everywhere," one voice repeated. "No clear front line." The confusion was total. Even as the Soviet aircraft pounded the Manchurian rail junctions, supply convoys continued to move toward non-existent objectives. The airfields that had once represented Japan's power in the north, Hailar, Mutanxiang, Taonan, now existed under the shadow of unseen enemies. In many cases, the Sat Japanese pilots could not even find the Soviet bases to retaliate. The enemy had camouflaged entire installations under netting and forest cover, invisible from the air until the moment of takeoff. It was as if the Soviets had learned invisibility itself. The more the Japanese reconnaissance units studied the terrain, the more impossible it seemed. The runways extended for kilometers, capable of launching heavy bombers that Japan had believed could not operate in the region's climate. Fuel dumps were hidden in the folds of the hills, connected by underground piping. Even radar and radio beacons appeared in places the Japanese had mapped as empty farmland. The suddenness of their appearance gave rise to rumors that the Soviets had used prefabricated structures, that entire airfields had been assembled from modular components brought by rail from Siberia. In truth, it was less a miracle than the result of industrial mobilization on a scale Japan could no longer imagine. For every Japanese plane that struggled to find spare parts, the Soviet Union could supply an entire squadron from reserves. In the days that followed, the air over Manchuria changed character. The once familiar sound of Japanese engines faded, replaced by the relentless hum of Soviet patrols. Pilots flying evacuation missions described skies filled with contrails stretching from horizon to horizon, evidence of continuous movement. The Soviets did not merely occupy, they mapped, photographed, and recorded every detail. Japanese air observers, looking down from their final flights, could see how the Soviet war machine advanced with terrifying order. Columns of tanks moving in rhythm with the flights above them, supply convoys reaching airfields at exact intervals. It was not improvisation, it was orchestration. And yet, beneath the mechanical precision, the Japanese pilots sensed something larger, the return of an empire they had ignored. The Soviet Union had risen from its silence, and it was announcing its presence not through diplomacy, but through geometry, through perfect lines of runways, grids of barracks, and the synchronized movement of machines across a continent. The airfields of Manchuria were not simply bases, they were declarations of dominance written on the earth. For the men who witnessed them from the air, the message was unmistakable. The world Japan had tried to control was already being divided without them. In the aftermath of those first encounters, the surviving Japanese squadrons retreated into disarray. Their airstrips, once symbols of imperial permanence, became fragile islands surrounded by advancing Soviet columns. Every dawn brought new reports. Another field captured, another communication line cut, another squadron grounded for lack of fuel. The airmen who had flown over the mysterious Soviet bases only days before found themselves grounded, watching from the edge of the tarmac as their own infrastructure crumbled. The irony was cruel. They had ruled the skies over Asia for nearly a decade, yet in their final days they were trapped on their own airfields, unable to take off, waiting for an enemy whose strength they had never measured. The intelligence archives later revealed the scope of the Soviet preparation. In the months leading to August 1945, entire air armies had been transferred east under the cover of darkness, using the Trans-Siberian Railway as a lifeline. Pilots, engineers, and maintenance crews arrived in waves, their presence hidden under the facade of routine redeployment. To Japanese observers, the movement was invisible. The Siberian wilderness masked everything. Even aerial reconnaissance, when it ventured near the Soviet frontier, saw only snow, forest, and rail smoke. Behind that smoke, airfields grew by the dozen, each built to a precise design: parallel runways, hardened shelters, and dispersal zones lined with decoy equipment to mislead any prying eyes. When the Red Army struck, the illusion dissolved, and the truth emerged all at once. It had never been a border, only a curtain. Within the Kwantung Army's headquarters, disbelief turned into paralysis. Officers who had once lectured on the weaknesses of Soviet aviation now spoke in whispers about its precision. Messages from field units grew desperate. One airbase commander near Mutanchiang described how Soviet paratroopers landed directly on his field hours after the first bombing run. They knew every structure, every hangar, he wrote. It was as if they had practiced the assault 100 times. The realization that Soviet intelligence had mapped their defenses in such detail destroyed what little morale remained. Pilots began burning documents, destroying navigation maps, and dismantling aircraft to prevent capture. Many of them had no illusions about escape. Their only mission was to erase traces of a war already lost. For the Japanese pilots who continued to fly, the experience was surreal. They took off into skies already dominated by an invisible presence. Soviet radar tracked their movements the moment they left the ground. Attempts at reconnaissance were met by immediate interception. The Japanese aircraft, often outdated Nakajimas and Kawasaki's, could not outclimb or outgun their pursuers. Engagements that once lasted minutes now ended in seconds. Yet the pilots continued to fly, compelled by duty more than strategy. They recorded what they saw with the detachment of chroniclers documenting their own extinction. Vast convoys moving along new roads, columns of trucks converging on airstrips freshly captured, and Soviet engineers marking out new landing grounds even as the front advanced. Those who survived described a landscape transformed almost overnight. Where there had been rice fields, there were now assembly points for armored units. Airfields that had been Japanese for years now bore Soviet insignia, their taxiways repainted, their control towers occupied by new commanders issuing orders in Russian. It was not occupation as the Japanese had imagined it, chaotic and improvised, but methodical replacement. The Soviet system consumed the old and replaced it with its own order, as if history itself had changed ownership. To the airmen watching from the ground, it felt like the erasure of their world. One pilot, Lieutenant Tsuboi, left a note before surrendering his aircraft. "We believed we could see everything from the air, but there are things that grow in silence, beneath the clouds. We saw them too late." His words captured the quiet despair shared by many. The pilots were not defeated in combat, they were outmaneuvered in time. The Soviets had spent years preparing for a moment that Japan had convinced itself would never come. When it did, the result was not a battle, but revelation. The skies over Manchuria were no longer a domain of valor, but a mirror reflecting the empire's illusions. As the Soviet advance deepened, the Japanese Air Command received its final orders: preserve nothing, resist only if attacked directly, and await instructions from Tokyo. But Tokyo had already ceased to exist as a source of command. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were gone. The emperor's voice trembled across the radio, and in Manchuria, the pilots listened to silence. Many abandoned their aircraft on the runways, removing the propellers to render them useless. Others destroyed their flight logs, unwilling to let their last missions be recorded as failures. A few chose to take off one final time, flying eastward into the rising sun, where the Soviet lines closed like a net. The myth of Japanese air superiority ended not with dogfights, but with realization. The airfields they had once dismissed as primitive were now models of efficiency, supported by an infrastructure so vast that no single photograph could capture it. The Soviets had mastered something beyond technology. They had mastered concealment. And for the men who once believed the sky could never lie, that was the hardest truth of all. The last flights over Manchuria were acts of ritual rather than war. Pilots took off into skies already lost, circling above columns of smoke that marked the roots of Soviet armor. The air itself seemed changed, filled with the distant echo of engines that never ceased, as if the horizon itself were alive with machines. From their altitude, the Japanese flyers could trace the pattern of conquest not by battles, but by construction. Every captured field became a new Soviet base within hours, marked by the orderly placement of tents, radio masts, and fuel trucks. It was the signature of an army that did not pause. The Japanese airmen, once masters of improvisation and courage, now watched an enemy that had replaced instinct with system. At first, many refused to believe that the Soviets had built such infrastructure in secrecy. Rumors circulated that the airfields had been constructed by forced labor only weeks earlier, that Soviet engineers had used pre-assembled runways brought by rail from the West. Others claimed that the bases were illusions, decoys projected by clever camouflage. Yet as more pilots were captured and interrogated, the truth surfaced in fragments. The airfields were real, and they had been there for months. Soviet engineers had disguised them with layers of deception: dummy farmhouses hiding control stations, grass strips concealing concrete beneath, hangars buried under canvas painted to mimic terrain. What the Japanese had mistaken for empty fields had been sleeping fortresses. The revelation spread through the remaining air units like a contagion. Every photograph, every map, every reconnaissance report was re-examined in a new light. Places once marked as insignificant villages turned out to be nodes in a hidden network. The realization was unbearable, that the Empire's intelligence apparatus, which had prided itself on seeing everything from the air, had been staring at the truth for years without understanding it. The pilots' disbelief transformed into silence, and their silence into resignation. "We had flown over ghosts," one officer later recalled. "The fields were alive even when we thought them dead." Meanwhile, the Soviet advance unfolded with mathematical precision. Every few hours, new squadrons appeared from the north and west, their formations tight and symmetrical. The Japanese observers who had studied aerial tactics in Germany recognized the discipline instantly, mass coordination perfected through endless drills. The Soviets fought as a single organism, their air cover synchronized with armor columns below. In contrast, the remnants of the Japanese Air Corps operated in fragments, without command or communication. Their missions were reactive, improvised, desperate. When they encountered Soviet aircraft, it was never in equal numbers. They fought briefly, vanished into the clouds, and often did not return. By mid-August, Manchuria's sky belonged entirely to the Red Army. The Japanese pilots who survived now flew only to evacuate civilians or to carry messages between isolated garrisons. From above, they saw a world being rewritten. Soviet supply convoys followed the railways like arteries of steel, and each captured airfield became a heartbeat in the new rhythm of occupation. The empire that had once prided itself on expansion was now shrinking visibly, its outposts swallowed by an advancing grid. The sight of Soviet insignia painted over Japanese markings struck the pilots like a physical wound. It was more than defeat. It was replacement. What astonished them most was the speed of transformation. Within days of capture, Soviet engineers would resurface runways, repair hangars, and install radio equipment. Their efficiency bordered on the impossible. Japanese ground crews who surrendered described being ordered to continue their work, now under Soviet supervision. They worked without rest, one recalled. They built in silence. Even at night, we heard the hammering. The tempo was relentless. Each completed airfield fed the next advance, like links in a chain pulling an empire apart. It was conquest by construction. As word of the emperor's surrender reached Manchuria, the surviving airmen listened without expression. The voice was distant, trembling, almost human in its fragility. Some knelt beside their grounded aircraft. Others simply stared into the sky, where Soviet formations moved like migrating birds across a new dawn. For them, the war's end was not liberation, but confirmation of what they had already witnessed. That Japan's destiny had been decided long before Hiroshima, long before Nagasaki, perhaps even before Pearl Harbor. It had ended in the quiet expansion of Soviet airfields no one had seen. The final missions were flown not against the enemy, but against time itself. Pilots carried evacuation orders, surrender documents, and in some cases, the ashes of their comrades. Their flight paths crossed the very airfields that had once filled them with disbelief. Now they saw them from a lower altitude, the details unmistakable. Fresh paint on runways, Soviet trucks lined in perfect rows, the red star gleaming where the rising sun once was. Some planes dipped their wings in acknowledgement before turning back toward Japan, leaving behind the continent they had once claimed as their own. For those who looked down one last time, the memory would never fade. The endless symmetry of Soviet airfields, built in silence and revealed in thunder. The surrender did not bring clarity. For the men who had flown over Manchuria in those final weeks, the war did not end with peace, but with an unanswered question. How could such power have existed so close, unseen? In the silence that followed, the survivors tried to reconstruct the chain of deception. Intelligence officers gathered in abandoned offices, spreading out maps faded from constant handling. They traced the routes of Soviet rail lines, compared the dimensions of newly discovered runways, and marked the locations of fuel depots they had once dismissed as farms. Each revelation deepened the humiliation. The evidence had always been there. The faint shadows on reconnaissance photos, the patterns of roads that seemed to lead nowhere. They had been looking at the truth for years, yet their doctrine had blinded them to it. In the autumn of 1945, as prisoners of war in Soviet camps, Japanese pilots were questioned about what they had seen. The interrogators wanted details: the number of aircraft, the layout of bases, the reaction in Manchuria when the invasion began. Many of the captured airmen spoke without resistance. They described their disbelief, their confusion, their awe. The Soviets listened quietly, sometimes with the faintest trace of irony. They knew that what the Japanese called impossible had been a calculated act of patience. Years of logistics had converged into 1 week of lightning war. To the Japanese, it seemed supernatural. To the Soviets, it was merely arithmetic. In the ruins of Harbin and Mukden, abandoned airfields became vast depots for Soviet transport planes. What had once been Japanese command posts were now filled with crates of machinery and supplies marked with Cyrillic letters. The transformation was absolute. Japanese mechanics, forced into service, watched as their own aircraft were dismantled piece by piece, the metal melted down to repair Soviet machines. The symbolism was brutal. The empire's wings were being consumed to feed another's flight. Those who had once believed themselves the guardians of Asia now labored as ground crews for their conquerors. Yet amid this reversal, a strange respect emerged. Some Japanese officers, when speaking privately among themselves, admitted admiration for the precision of the Soviet operation. "They built the future while we built legends," one wrote in his diary. The Soviet approach to war, methodical, industrial, faceless, stood in contrast to the Japanese creed of sacrifice. It was not glory that had triumphed in Manchuria, but calculation. The pilots who had once sworn by the code of the samurai now understood that numbers, railways, and factories had replaced valor as the weapons of empire. As the months passed, the story of the Manchurian airfields became a kind of forbidden legend among surviving officers. Some refused to speak of it at all, as if silence could preserve the dignity that defeat had stripped away. Others studied it obsessively, trying to piece together how such deception had been executed. They learned that entire Soviet construction brigades had operated under civilian covers, listed as agricultural or railway units. Even local Manchurian collaborators had not realized the true purpose of the sites they were helping to build. The Soviet engineers had disguised their runways as irrigation projects, their hangars as warehouses. Only when the camouflage nets were lifted in August 1945 did the illusion collapse. What astonished the Japanese most, in retrospect, was the restraint with which the Soviets had hidden their strength. Unlike the Western allies, who flaunted their bombing campaigns, the Red Army had cultivated invisibility. It was a philosophy of power, expressed through silence. The pilots who had flown above the tundra years earlier remembered endless stretches of wilderness, snow, forest, river, nothing more. Now they understood that beneath that silence had been preparation. Every empty space on their maps had been an error, every assumption a flaw. The Soviets had not merely concealed their airfields, they had concealed their future. By the time the Japanese prisoners were released, the memory of those airfields had already begun to dissolve into myth. Many refused to speak of them upon returning home, fearing disbelief or indifference. Post-war Japan preferred other stories. Stories of cities rebuilt, of democracy reborn, of tragedy overcome. The images of Manchuria, of hidden airfields and the roar of unseen squadrons did not fit the new narrative. They belonged to a vanished world, a shadow between the collapse of one empire and the rise of another. Yet among the few surviving airmen, the memory endured like an unfinished map in the mind. A pattern of runways spreading across the plains, symbols of a power that had waited in silence until the moment the sky itself betrayed them. For historians who later examined the records, the photographs from August 1945 became a puzzle that revealed the nature of the modern war. The images showed the end of illusion, the moment when faith in bravery gave way to the cold precision of industry. The Japanese pilots, looking down upon those Soviet airfields, had not only seen the enemy's strength, they had witnessed the beginning of a new era, one in which power would no longer be measured by courage but by infrastructure, by the ability to build unseen and strike without warning. In that revelation, the skies over Manchuria became more than a battlefield. They became the mirror of a century turning. The archives that survived the war tell a strange and haunting story. Among the fragments recovered from the ruins of Manchurian command posts were rolls of film, reconnaissance photographs taken by Japanese pilots in the final days before surrender. Many of the images were blurred by motion or cloud, yet even in their grainy patterns, one can see the outlines of Soviet airfields emerging from what had once been emptiness. Historians who later studied the film spoke of a kind of visual shock, a moment when the illusion of superiority dissolved into the geometry of defeat. Each frame captured a truth too vast to comprehend in its own time. The empire had been surrounded not by armies, but by preparation. One series of photographs taken above the Amur River on August 8th revealed an airbase so new that its tire tracks still shone with moisture. The layout was unmistakably modern: concrete runways, dispersal loops, and the signature star painted in faint red on the tail of a parked fighter. The accompanying notes in the pilot's handwriting were simple: unknown base, size exceeds any known in region, activity continuous. That pilot did not return from his next mission. His report was found weeks later, unopened, on a desk in Harbin already occupied by Soviet officers. His discovery became part of a broader revelation that while Japanese aviation had lived by movement, the Soviets had lived by patience. In the years before the invasion, the Japanese had convinced themselves that Manchuria's geography was its own defense. The mountains, the deserts, the long reaches of Siberian wilderness, all seemed to promise natural protection. The notion that an industrial superstructure could rise within such terrain appeared absurd. Yet the Soviets had achieved exactly that, turning geography itself into concealment. They built under the forest canopy, within river valleys, beneath camouflage nets that blended perfectly with the soil. Satellite imagery decades later confirmed what the pilots had once glimpsed through haze and disbelief. A network of bases stretching from Chita to Vladivostok, each aligned with rail lines capable of sustaining a continental offensive. It was not improvisation, it was orchestration on a continental scale. For the pilots who had lived through that final summer, the memory of discovery fused with the memory of collapse. They remembered the taste of metal in the air, the smell of burned fuel, the strange calm that followed each Soviet strike. Many spoke of the silence that hung over their remaining airfields. No orders, no reinforcements, only the distant rumble of engines drawing nearer. To them, the Soviet airfields had not been mere military sites. They were symbols of inevitability. Once they appeared, the war's end could no longer be denied. It was as if the sky itself had changed sides, one veteran recalled. We were still flying in daylight, but the light no longer belonged to us. In post-war interrogations, Soviet officers described their preparation without triumphalism. They spoke of logistics, of schedules, of engineering. To them, the construction of those airfields had been a technical problem solved through discipline. They had moved mountains of concrete and steel across 10,000 kilometers of track, all timed to coincide with the expiration of their neutrality pact. There was no mystery, only precision. But to the Japanese, who had built their empire through audacity and belief, such precision seemed alien, an order beyond human imagination. It was not the Soviets' technology that terrified them. It was their method. When the war ended, most of the Manchurian airfields were absorbed into the Soviet Far Eastern Command. Some were expanded, others abandoned, yet their presence remained etched into the land. Villages grew around them, grass covered their taxiways, children played on runways once crossed by squadrons of bombers. But beneath that quiet surface, the old concrete endured, the ghost of an empire's awakening moment. In the decades that followed, travelers who stumbled upon those forgotten sites sometimes found fragments of Japanese instruments, rusted fuel drums, and shards of glass from cockpit canopies. The wind across the steppe carried no memory, but the ground remembered. The few Japanese pilots who survived into old age spoke of those fields not with hatred, but with wonder. They described the first time they saw the Soviet formations rising from what they thought was empty plain, the shock of symmetry, the impossible scale. Some confessed that in that instant they understood history had turned against them, that empires end not in battle, but in realization. For them, Manchuria had been a lesson written in dust and steel, that silence, when harnessed by power, becomes the deadliest weapon. Even after decades, the question persisted among historians. How could the Japanese intelligence apparatus, so experienced and disciplined, have failed to detect such vast construction? The answer lay partly in faith. The empire had believed in its own myth, in the idea that its enemies were incapable of matching its will. Every photograph that might have suggested otherwise had been dismissed, every report that contradicted doctrine quietly filed away. The Soviets understood this weakness. They built their empire beneath the line of sight, knowing their enemy would never look for what he did not believe could exist. And when the day came, the revelation was total, not just of new airfields, but of a new world. By the time the last Japanese reconnaissance missions ended, the sky above Manchuria had become a mirror reflecting the shape of the future. Industrial war had replaced imperial war. The age of courage had given way to the age of coordination. And for those who had seen the transformation from the cockpit, the memory remained sharper than any photograph. Endless plains, silent runways, and the sudden realization that the power rising from those Soviet airfields was not temporary, but permanent. The world that emerged from the ashes of Manchuria was not one the pilots could recognize. For years they had been told that war was the domain of spirit, of courage, of sacrifice, of the will to ascend above the ordinary. Yet what they had witnessed in August 1945 destroyed that belief. The Soviets had revealed that war had entered a new dimension, one ruled by engineering, mathematics, and concealment. The power that conquered them did not shout or boast, it built. When the Red Army advanced into Manchuria, it did so not with the chaos of invasion, but with the calm inevitability of machinery operating according to plan. The airfields were not the beginning of conquest, they were its proof. Among the captured documents studied by post-war researchers was a Soviet planning directive issued in late 1944, months before the Yalta Conference. It detailed the exact placement of future airbases across the Manchurian frontier, their coordinates, elevation, and intended aircraft capacity. The precision of the document astonished Western analysts decades later. Every runway, every depot had been accounted for before a single Japanese officer suspected war. The Soviets had planned not merely to invade, but to occupy through infrastructure. To the Japanese, whose air power had been sustained by improvisation and bravery, the revelation was devastating. The very idea of strategy had changed. In the Japanese debriefings held after the surrender, former officers tried to explain the moment of discovery, the first time they saw the Soviet airfields. Many spoke in metaphors, unable to describe the experience directly. "It was like seeing the future," said one. "A landscape we thought we knew suddenly rearranged itself." Another recalled how the symmetry of the bases frightened him more than the aircraft. Everything was in order, even the shadows seemed disciplined. For men who had been raised to believe that chaos could be mastered through spirit, such order felt unnatural. The enemy's silence was not weakness, it was control. The Soviets, for their part, viewed the campaign as vindication. They had learned from earlier defeats, from the disaster at Khalkhin Gol, from the lessons of 1941, and had rebuilt their military doctrine around preparation and surprise. Their engineers studied the mistakes of the Germans and the mobility of the Americans. By 1945, they had transformed their eastern territories into a logistical machine capable of producing airfields in weeks. The Japanese pilots who saw those results from the sky did not know they were witnessing the culmination of half a decade of systematic expansion. To them, it seemed like magic. To the Soviets, it was simply the consequence of mathematics multiplied by will. As the Red Army consolidated its hold over Manchuria, new squadrons arrived daily. The Soviet bases that had astonished Japanese reconnaissance in August became permanent installations, connected by roads and rail lines to Vladivostok, Khabarovsk, and Irkutsk. The noise of engines never ceased. From morning to night, transports, bombers, and fighters moved in rhythm, their flight paths crossing the same skies that Japanese pilots had once ruled alone. The transformation was both physical and psychological, the erasure of one empire and the establishment of another. In that transformation, the Japanese airmen who remained in captivity could only listen to the echo of what they had lost. For some, the experience became an obsession. They replayed the last missions in memory, analyzing every cloud, every glint of metal, trying to pinpoint the moment when disbelief became recognition. They spoke of how the airfields seemed to appear all at once, as if the land itself had shifted overnight. But the truth, which they would learn only later, was that nothing had appeared suddenly. It had all been growing in silence, like a forest unseen until one looks down from above. The Soviet Union had turned the vastness of Siberia into a weapon, hiding armies in geography, disguising infrastructure as emptiness. Japan, blinded by its own confidence, had never thought to look for life in the void. In the post-war years, when Japanese officers were asked to write reports for Allied intelligence, many confessed that they had underestimated not only Soviet strength, but Soviet imagination. "They built the invisible," one wrote, "and we built what could be bombed." That statement became a quiet epitaph for an empire that had misunderstood modern war. Courage alone could no longer hold the sky. It required factories, fuel, and foresight. The Soviets had all three, and they used them to create a theater of power that stretched from the Pacific to the Urals. The Japanese pilots had been among the first to witness that new order, even if they did not understand it. For decades afterward, the memory of those hidden airfields haunted military historians. Western observers during the Cold War, studying reconnaissance photos of Soviet bases in the Far East, often referred to them as the descendants of Manchuria. The same principles applied: secrecy, dispersion, resilience. The lesson learned in 1945 had become doctrine. Every runway built since then carried within it the echo of that moment when Japanese pilots realized that the map of the world was larger than they had believed. The invisible had become the decisive. By the time Japan rebuilt its own air force under a new flag, most of the men who had flown over Manchuria were gone. Yet the images they left behind, those blurred photographs, those diary fragments, remained as silent witnesses. In them lay the transformation of warfare itself, from courage to calculation, from vision to concealment. The airfields that once defied belief had become symbols of an age when the ski, once boundless, was conquered not by wings, but by the will to prepare. In the winter that followed Japan's surrender, Manchuria became a landscape of ghosts. The Soviet airfields that had once startled Japanese reconnaissance now stood under snow, their runways lined with silent aircraft awaiting transfer or dismantling. Yet even in stillness, the impression of movement remained. Locals spoke of how the ground itself seemed to hum, as if the machinery of war had been buried alive beneath the frost. For the Soviet engineers who maintained the sites, the transformation of these bases into permanent strongholds was a matter of routine. For the few Japanese prisoners who worked among them, it was a lesson written in cold stone. Empire had given way to system, and system endured. The Soviets wasted no time converting their wartime achievements into strategic infrastructure. Fuel depots became refineries. Barracks turned into training academies. Airfields once meant for invasion now linked a new frontier of power. The Japanese prisoners who hauled equipment across the frozen runways could only marvel at the scale of organization. There were no speeches, no slogans, only work. Every bolt, every section of steel seemed to fit into a larger pattern invisible to the eye. The same discipline that had built the hidden airfields was now building permanence. What had been temporary had become eternal. News of these developments reached Tokyo slowly, through occupation authorities and returning prisoners. To most of Japan's population, Manchuria was already a fading memory, a territory of loss, a distant chapter closed by defeat. Yet among former officers and pilots, the reports carried an eerie familiarity. The Soviets had not dismantled the airfields, they had expanded them. What had begun as wartime deception had become a post-war statement. For decades, those bases would serve as launching points for Soviet patrols across the Pacific frontier, the visible continuation of the power the Japanese pilots had once glimpsed in disbelief. The story of their discovery was no longer about 1945 alone. It was the first page of the Cold War in Asia. Some of the Japanese airmen who returned home tried to warn their new government that the Soviets had established an enduring military corridor across Manchuria and Siberia. Few listened. The country was rebuilding from ruin. Memories of the past were inconvenient. The veterans' testimonies were filed away, untranslated, unread. But in private gatherings, among men who had worn the same insignia, the conversations continued. They spoke of the flights in the last days, of the runways that had appeared like mirages, of the sensation of seeing a future they could not yet describe. It was the moment we understood that power could hide, one pilot told a journalist years later, and that hiding it made it stronger. The Soviet air doctrine born in Manchuria influenced generations of planners. The idea of dispersed, camouflaged, and rapidly constructed air bases became a foundation of military strategy from Eastern Europe to the Arctic. Western intelligence, studying the phenomenon during the early Cold War, came to the same conclusion the Japanese had reached too late, that the Soviet mastery of concealment was not an accident but a philosophy. The infrastructure that had astonished Japanese pilots in 1945 was the prototype of a new kind of war, one in which visibility itself became a vulnerability. Power would now exist beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when revelation was as destructive as any bomb. For Japan, the experience became an unspoken cautionary tale. The post-war self-defense forces, when they eventually re-established aviation training, emphasized reconnaissance and detection above all else. Every photograph, every radar echo, every anomaly on the map became a potential warning. The ghosts of Manchuria lingered in doctrine even when the men who had seen them were gone. The idea that an enemy could construct an empire unseen haunted the imagination of planners for decades. In the silence of new radar rooms and control towers, the question remained, what else might be building beyond the horizon? Meanwhile, in the vastness of Siberia, many of the original airfields endured untouched. Some became civilian airports, their wartime origins erased from memory. Others were swallowed by vegetation, their concrete cracked and overtaken by grass. Yet aerial imagery taken long after the war revealed their design still visible from above. Perfect rectangles aligned with the compass, the geometry of empire preserved in decay. For historians, these ghost airfields became archaeological evidence of how the 20th century learned to hide its strength. Each strip of cracked pavement was a sentence in the long, unfinished chronicle of preparation. Among the last surviving Japanese pilots, memory itself became a kind of archive. In interviews conducted decades later, their voices carried the same mixture of awe and disbelief that had filled their reports in 1945. They spoke of the light over the plains, the feeling of insignificance before such scale, the moment of realization that their maps had lied. They no longer spoke of victory or defeat, only of perception. What they had witnessed was larger than war. It was the arrival of a world where power no longer needed to be seen to be absolute. Time softened the memory, but it never erased it. When post-war Japan entered its long period of reconstruction, the story of the Soviet airfields in Manchuria remained buried in private recollections, whispered in officers' clubs or written in journals never meant for publication. The pilots who had seen them were men out of time, witnesses to a kind of warfare their nation no longer wished to remember. They had served an empire that vanished, and they had glimpsed the birth of another that would dominate half the world. For them, the memory of those vast, silent runways was not nostalgia, but unfinished business, a vision they had tried to understand and never could. In the 1950s, a handful of military historians began to uncover fragments of the old reports. They were astonished to find that much of Japan's intelligence on Soviet aviation had been accurate, but ignored. Photographs had been developed, coordinates recorded, and even partial maps drawn of airstrips along the Amur and in Primorye. The problem had not been evidence, but belief. Commanders, bound by the assumption that Stalin would never risk war in the East while Germany still fought in Europe, dismissed their own data. The airfields existed on paper, but only as anomalies, curiosities that contradicted what the empire thought it knew about the world. When those anomalies became reality in August 1945, the result was a kind of national blindness. For the Soviets, the operation became a model of strategic deception. The Red Army's after-action reports described the airfield network not as improvisation, but as infrastructure warfare, the creation of space that guarantees victory before the first shot is fired. To Japanese eyes, it had seemed miraculous. To the Soviets, it was an equation solved by manpower, logistics, and concealment. Later generations of Soviet officers studied Manchuria as a demonstration of what could be achieved when secrecy, terrain, and timing worked together. Each airfield, they wrote, was a weapon of silence. Western observers learned from it too. In the early years of the Cold War, American reconnaissance planes flying over Siberia captured images of new Soviet bases built on the same principles as those of 1945, dispersed, hidden, self-sustaining. Analysts at the Pentagon studying those photos remarked that The Russians build their victories before the war begins. The insight was the same one that Japanese pilots had realized too late, that modern power is not revealed in combat, but in preparation. The lesson of Manchuria echoed across decades: unseen construction, invisible readiness, and the quiet confidence of those who can wait. For Japan, the moral weight of that realization was heavy. The men who had once believed that courage could substitute for resources came to see their defeat not as an accident of fate, but as a mathematical certainty. They had entered the 20th century still carrying the dreams of the 19th, dreams of honor, of sudden triumph, of destiny. The Soviets had entered armed with blueprints, rail schedules, and weather charts. The outcome had been decided long before the first flight. What the Japanese pilots saw from the air in those final days was not only the collapse of an empire, but the unveiling of a new logic. The age of preparation had replaced the age of prophecy. Some of the last survivors lived long enough to witness the technological revolutions that followed: jet engines, satellites, computers. They often spoke of these not with wonder, but with recognition. "It is the same," one veteran said in an interview in the 1970s, "machines building more machines. The world we saw from the sky in Manchuria was already this world." His words echoed a sentiment shared by many who had once believed that history could be shaped by will. They now understood that history was built by systems too vast to be seen from the cockpit. In Russia, too, the memory lingered quietly. Military engineers in the Far East still spoke of the Manchurian miracle, the operation that had proven the power of planning over surprise. Some of those airfields remained in service through the 1980s, their runways lengthened to receive jet bombers that would carry a new kind of threat. The geometry the Japanese pilots had first glimpsed in 1945, the perfect order of lines and angles across the steppe, became a signature of the Cold War. To outsiders, they were just bases. To those who remembered, they were monuments to a moment when the world turned beneath unseeing eyes. And so the story survived, not in official histories, but in fragments, in photographs locked in archives, in fading notes written in precise handwriting, in the memory of men who once flew over a landscape that defied belief. The shock of that vision never left them. They had looked down expecting emptiness and found an empire instead. What they saw was not just the end of Japan's war, but the beginning of another age. One where the boundaries of power could no longer be drawn on maps because they were buried in the earth itself. In the long decades that followed, the story of those final flights became a kind of parable among military scholars, the moment when vision failed and the unseen conquered the visible. The Japanese pilots who had once soared above Manchuria in confidence left behind more than reconnaissance photographs. They left a warning carved in the silence between images. Every empire believes it can see its enemies. Every generation assumes that power must reveal itself, but the skies of 1945 proved otherwise. Power can grow unseen, gathering behind borders and illusions until the moment it chooses to reveal itself. And by then, revelation is the final act, not the beginning. The reconstruction of events, pieced together from diaries, Soviet records, and fragments of film, now reads like an inevitability disguised as surprise. For years, Japan's attention had been fixed on the Pacific, its eyes turned southward toward islands and oceans. The North, wide and barren, had seemed harmless. Yet in that emptiness, the Soviet Union had rehearsed a new kind of war. It had learned how to make time its ally, how to let the landscape itself become camouflage. When the Japanese pilots finally looked, they saw the result of years of invisible motion. What appeared to them as sudden creation had been unfolding slowly, patiently, just beyond the horizon of belief. Some of the airmen who survived long enough to speak in their old age described those moments not as terror, but as awakening. They said that, for the first time, they understood what modern war truly meant, not the clash of courage, but the collision of systems. The sight of those perfect runways and endless rows of machines stripped the mystery from warfare and replaced it with something colder: process. To them, the Soviet airfields in Manchuria were less the symbols of defeat than the symbols of a world that had moved beyond the reach of the individual. No amount of valor could alter a design built on such scale. When the archives opened after the Cold War, researchers discovered how far the Soviet deception had gone. Construction materials for those hidden bases had been disguised as railway supplies, Work brigades had operated under civilian names. Even Soviet pilots stationed nearby had been told their bases were temporary training grounds. The illusion was total, and it endured right up to the hour Stalin gave the order to attack. What had astonished Japanese airmen in the sky was the culmination of a deception that reached across continents and years. The Red Army had not outflown Japan. It had outweighted it. And yet, there was something almost poetic in the symmetry of it all. The same land that had once been Japan's testing ground for imperial ambition became the stage on which another empire demonstrated its patience. The Japanese had once imagined Manchuria as a realm to be remade in their image. The Soviets remade it instead into a mirror of their doctrine, vast, disciplined, indifferent. Where Japan sought glory, the Soviet Union built endurance. The difference lay not in ideology but in rhythm. One empire burned brightly and briefly, the other expanded in silence, its strength hidden until the moment it was complete. In the final reflections written by surviving Japanese officers, one phrase appears again and again: "We did not see." It was an admission both literal and metaphoric. They had flown over the evidence, photographed it, and dismissed it. They had looked directly at the shape of their own undoing and called it impossible. The Soviet airfields in Manchuria were not only a military surprise, they were a mirror held up to human certainty. They showed how belief can blind even those trained to see. Today, the remnants of those airfields still exist, faint scars on the satellite images of the modern frontier. The runways are overgrown, the hangars collapsed, the rail spurs rusted. But viewed from above, the outlines remain. Grids of order imposed upon wilderness, the geometry of a vanished age. In those ghostly patterns lies the echo of the moment when the world shifted from the age of empires to the age of systems. The Japanese pilots who once hovered above them became the first witnesses to a truth that would define the rest of the century: that the future belongs not to those who shout the loudest, but to those who build in silence. The shock they felt that morning over Manchuria, the disbelief that such vast airfields could exist unseen, was more than the end of their war. It was the first glimpse of the modern world, the revelation that power could hide behind normality, that might could be disguised as emptiness, and that the most decisive victories begin long before the first battle. When the Japanese pilots looked down and saw the impossible written across the plains, they were not merely witnessing defeat. They were watching the 20th century being born.